So it came to my attention that there's Elden Ring cut dialogue and I wanted to talk about it. Firstly, credit to Ividion for the Impaler's archive, which is where I found the Messmer and Radahn stuff. Secondly, credit to Sekiro for bringing some of the stuff up and just posting about it on Twitter. Also, then linking to the Rellana and Romina stuff on Bilibili. I don't know how that site works, to be honest. It's all in Chinese, so I'm just going to reference and link that stuff in the description, so you're welcome to look through it and all, and a credit to the person who it was from. So let's just talk straight away about the Messmer dialogue. Now, there's a single line which I will play here.
Mongrel intruder, Miquella spoke of thee. Thou art tarnished, it seemeth.
Now that you've listened to that, yeah, it's strange. Miquella spoke of thee, which means that firstly, Miquella and Messmer talked. Secondly, they talked about us at some point, and that was enough of a thing that he's not confused that we're there, but he's confused that we're tarnished. And I think that's a really important distinction to realize. Now, obviously, firstly, just got to quickly talk about how everything that's cut is cut probably for a reason. They didn't want us to either know that Miquella and Messmer spoke, or they wanted to leave it ambiguous whether they did, or something in between. And I think for this line, it being cut is probably still good, but we'll just talk about that in a bit. So firstly, did Miquella intend for us to just pick up the kindling as one of his followers and just go on his way? Was that the first thing? The first question I think that's really important is why wouldn't Messmer just give Miquella the kindling himself? And with that, we have two big routes here. Either Miquella's no, I can't physically take this kindling, it's not for me, and somebody's gonna come pick it up, one of my followers. Or alternatively, Miquella and Messmer had a problem, and Messmer refused to give the kindling. With the first one, Miquella being unable to do it, I mean, physically he's unable to hold it, and maybe it's because it's a physical flame kind of thing, the kindling is fire, that it scared Miquella, or it caused Miquella to feel uncomfortable with the idea of actively holding it. Whereas somebody who, especially in the Frenzy Flame ending, we're physically able to hold the flame and have the flame within us in order to do it, and the Giant's flame was able to be held in the Giants, so it's possible that other beings are able to do so. He was just unable to because he doesn't have a body, or he's too scared to do so. That's possible. I don't think it's as likely as a second answer of Messmer being unwilling to part with the kindling. Either because Messmer physically can't until he's, died or something similar, or because if he was able to, he would have been giving up something of really great importance, or just didn't want to give it to Miquella. Right? The great importance, I think, makes a lot of sense considering that, the Scadutree, the sealing tree specifically, in Ene Ilim is there to seal Ene Ilim away from everything else as a symbol of your past is cut off. It was just as important as the sealing of the entirety of the Shadow Realm in a way, and it might have even happened beforehand. And so I think Messmer being unwilling to give up the ability to do that, I think is somewhat telling, right? So I think it's also important to mention that I think that it's very likely that Messmer doesn't really know Miquella and Malenia very well, especially since if vague timelines make sense for most of you, that Miquella and Malenia were likely the last of the children after Radahn left Rellana. And so if they are the last of those children, Radahn and Rellana's children with Radahn were around during the age when Messmer was there, because Gaius and Messmer were older brothers to Radahn, right? So he knows Radahn and he's talked to Radahn, whereas I don't necessarily know if it's still possible that he knew of Miquella and Malenia, but he may not have spent as much time with them or grown up teaching them or anything. There's no mention either way of them having a connection, right? And I think that's kind of telling, especially since Radahn is so big and important in all of this, whereas Miquella and Malenia don't really have any of those connections specifically. I guess I should also point out that the Fell twins, the Omen twins, Messmer probably never met them, or he may have known they existed, but never really spent time with them either. But I doubt he would have ever cared or loved for them either, considering they are the epitome of horn scent, almost. They are horned and they are harassed by the spirits of the horn scent, right? Who were crusaded. But yeah, either way, I think the point still stands that Miquella and Malenia not being known and Morgan Morgott not being known, they don't those things don't need to contradict each other. And so with Miquella and Malenia actively not being connected to Messmer, I think he just sees this kid functionally walk up to him, say he's Marika's and Radagon's child. Miquella's I'm going to ascend to godhood, and Messmer's just no. You're definitely not with my thing. You're Marika aligned. I don't my job here, right, is to go crusade people. I'm doing what I'm already doing. I don't care. You go do what you want to do. And then Miquella now has a reason to break his great rune one way or another, and he chooses to do so. Now, I think Miquella's general modus operandi with a lot of stuff is that he goes there, he says what he wants to do, he goes to do what he wants to do. If somebody decides that they don't want to have that happen, he charms them, or he has to bring somebody else to fight for him, right? With Malenia, then later with Radahn, he has that Godfrey-style individual who has to be next to him to go fight them if they don't want to do what he wants to do and bring an age of compassion. And so with Messmer, he sits there, he tries to get Messmer to do what he wants to do. He tries to charm him, and I don't think it worked, specifically because of the Dane set. He couldn't charm Messmer because Messmer doesn't have eyes. And so then he either has a hissy fit, breaks his great rune, or he decides, here, let me prove to you I'm not connected to Marika. I'm gonna break this thing that is given to me by Marika. It's like the great rune. I'm gonna break it and prove to you that I don't need it, and I'm more like you than you think. Messmer still just doesn't care. He discards the Great Rune, it goes down and lands with the Scadutree Avatar, and then that's it. Either the Scadutree Avatar is actively defending it for some reason, or he just did it, right? He just threw it out. And I think it's probably more likely to be the latter, to be honest. I mean, I think you could read it either way. And so either way, he breaks his Great Rune, and then Messmer's I still don't care. And then Miquella's I'm sending someone to come kill you. I'm sending someone to you. I need this kindling. And then Messmer's you're not going to kill me yourself. I'm going back to being in a corner, smoldering, not caring, right? And I think this particular reading, and I think all of these readings really play into that naivete that Miquella probably had, just kind of expecting things to work out, but obviously they don't, and then he's just oh, fuck, just gonna do something else kind of thing, right? You just keep creating plans and keep going one way or another. I think the interesting part here is that Messmer knows we're an intruder, calls us mongrel intruder, right? He doesn't like us. So, he always probably intended to fight us from the start, but he's surprised that we're tarnished. And the interesting thing is, he's not confused that Miquella sent a tarnished, he's confused that Miquella sent someone who's Marika's lord, who's a tarnished, or is going to be guided by Marika. And I think that's another thing that's really important, that Miquella must have mentioned that we were Marika's destined lord, or alternatively, Messmer could just kind of figure that out because of the strange mix of us being tarnished, but there's grace attached to us. And I think it's probably more likely the latter. I don't think Messmer just kind of knew instinctively, though he has an iris of grace, he has it bestowed upon him, so maybe he could have just told. Either way, I've just outlined a bunch of different possibilities for how this could all make sense, and the kind of important thing at the end of all of it is that it kind of doesn't really matter. One way or another, Miquella ended up in Shadowkeep. He abandons his right arm, he abandons his great rune. Whether he talks to Messmer or not, he could not by himself get the kindling. It doesn't he can't do that. He's not physically able to. And he needs someone to go get it. And so because he doesn't have Malenia's either dead at this point or indisposed, he didn't bring her along. He can't get Radahn yet. He needs the Divine Gate to get Radahn. He uses us instead. And with that, I feel it doesn't really matter, this line. It not being in the game. There are lines later that I'll talk about that actually really don't matter. And there are lines that I feel really did. But this one is kind of a little bit more inconsequential. We can assume that Miquella was in Shadowkeep. It's really obvious to tell that him talking to Messmer while there could have been assumed anyway, but it doesn't really, it just kind of adds more questions than it does anything else, and it kind of pulls away from Messmer as an antagonist and as a person for us to fight if we have to think about Miquella in that moment, right? Whereas taking that fight for its own merits and then thinking about Miquella later is just kind of fine. Another thing to note, of course, is that they probably record way more lines than are in the game. Both Egon's voice actor mentioned that at one point, I don't remember exactly where, but also just as an example, the gameplay trailer has a set of lines for Messmer that don't show up in the game. They are the same lines, but the takes are different. The lines that we get in the actual game are they kind of make him seem a fair bit more pathetic. He's not as imposing sounding and actively malicious. He's just Mother, why? And I think like that's just a lot better. I think it was a lot more interesting characterization. He's not just evil for evil's sake. He has like these reasons to do so, but he still does horrible things, even if he has a reason. And it kind of allows us to really see that cycle of people thinking that they're doing good. The cycle of violence keeps getting perpetuated in order for them to keep doing the things that they think are good, right? But like they're putting themselves back in power and perpetuating the cycle again and again and again and again. Now we're going to move on to the Radahn lines. Now, IMDb for this one credits a voice actor. Obviously, Messmer's voice actor was already credited. I don't really need to mention that. But Radahn doesn't have any lines, and so IMDb crediting a voice actor, Pip Torrens, is super strange. And the voice actor is the same voice actor as Vare. They are credited for 2022 as well, which is the main release of Elden Ring. So we can assume that they did the roars and the howl for Radahn, the howl where he like runs off and then howls at the moon and then comes back around to fight you. And I think it's really interesting that this person is credited again. And obviously the lines that I'm going to show you right now.
I am Radahn, born of red-maned Radahn and Rellana of the full moon, a lion bred for battle.
Those lines are really strange, but kind of also really inconsequential. They don't tell us anything new. He is the son of Radahn, of Rellana, and he is a lion bred for battle. The only thing that's really interesting there is just reproving that he really idolizes Godfrey and Sarosh with his lion bred for battle. That's like a big connection. That's really important to him, and that's kind of it. Everything else is just, this is who I am. Fear me. And it kind of takes away from the character, I think, because the other questions that we have about Radahn is, does he have autonomy in this moment? Does he have control over himself? He's just been brought back to life in Mohg's body, and we know that Miquella has a charm that takes over people, and the Great Rune seemingly being broken dispelled the charm over the rest of the other people, but he still has the ability to charm us in the fight. And by that extension, we know that there's potential that Radahn is or was charmed from the beginning. Like, as soon as he's been rebirthed, he has been charmed. And him speaking kind of pulls away from that and doesn't make us question whether he has autonomy, because him just being a bestial lion who just roars at us at most when we parry him, that's it. Like, that's all he is, right? As a battle. And him not being able to speak really pushes that caged, no autonomy, that, like, it brings us back to Marika and Radahn and how they don't speak. An Elder Beast doesn't speak. They are a caged divinity. And Miquella is going to be a caged divinity, and Radahn's already caged by Miquella. And I think that is lost by Radahn speaking. As actively, it takes away from that. And the other point is that Freya puts up this question of whether Radahn wanted a good, clean death, or whether he wanted eternal war. And like Freya being the goddess of the Valkyries, one of the Aesir in some tellings, one of the Vanir, if you connect to, one of the Vanir, sorry, in others, and connecting to Frigg and how like a lot of people like connect the two characters. Long story short, Queen of the Valkyries, the Valkyries were heralds who brought people to Asgard, brought people to Valhalla specifically, right? And allowed them to, after they died in battle, live an eternal life. Fighting, drinking, all of that, right? And Freya, this person named after that god, questioning whether he wanted an honorable death like that and that to be the end, whether he wanted eternal war. And Jeren being on the other side just being like, no, he wanted an honorable death, let's bring it to him as a champions of the festival. All of that is entirely thrown out the window when you hear a lion bred for war. He is just that then. As soon as he says that, that is it. And him, all of the things he says in this clip kind of loses a lot of the mystery, a lot of the intrigue, and just cuts it all off. But in the current version of the game, we are allowed to still speculate those things, and even with the cut content, as like is a classic thing that I've said a couple of times on this channel, but just will do so in the future. Cut content is usually cut for a reason. Sometimes it's cut because it's not in a state to like fully be finished. Sometimes it just is not the kind of vibe that they want to go for, and I think it's the latter in this case, and I think it's the latter in the first case as well. Both Messmer and Radahn, both of their lines are just kind of not necessary, and in fact they kind of take away the ability to do what Miyazaki thinks is so important from these games and fill in the gaps ourselves. They fill in the gaps for us. They're a bit too on the nose. Now we're going to talk about Rellana. I'm just going to play it straight away.
Rise, twin moons.
Rellana is an interesting one because IMDb also credits a voice actor, the voice actress Poppy Lee Fryer. Now, this is like basically nothing, and it probably would have been used during the multiple moon attack, the double moons and then the slam. And to be honest, it's something, and I think it would have been nice. I'm gonna be just very honest. I am very disappointed that Rellana and Romina don't get voice lines. They don't get cutscenes, they don't get anything. And they aren't hugely important to the Miquella story, they aren't hugely important to the Marika stuff per se, but the fact that they don't have anything is just like hugely disappointing. Rellana is one of my favorite fights by like a decent margin, and Romina is also really up there for me, but the fact that neither of them, they have like fantastic music as well, but neither of them have a cutscene or even a whiff of dialogue is such a shame. And it's even more a shame that both of them are these badass feminine fighting characters and they get nothing. I can't help but feel disappointed. The line itself is interesting, and I think it would have been interesting to be in a situation where she doesn't say absolutely anything during the entire fight, and then once she gets to phase 2, she just drops the twin moons. Like, she just says it, drops the twin moons on you. That would be fucking astounding. That would be so fantastic. But it's not the case. And while I say that, we're going to get to Romina in a second, but there is a small possibility that because these audio files exist, they might say those things, they just say them really quietly, right? Now, back to Poppy Lee Fryer. She is credited, and I think like the main reason that's the case is because Rellana does indeed have sounds. She does make sound effects as she fights, and she has a very distinctive death scream, which I'm going to play right now. And like, that's great, and I think those are really cool, right? But it's just a shame we didn't get any actual voice lines or cutscenes. On to Romina, very similar thing here, almost exactly the same. IMDb credits a voice actor, Emma Ballantyne, I'm not sure how to say that, my apologies. And again, doesn't really make a difference. It's possible that this particular voice line, which I'm going to play now,
"Children of the tower, butterflies take wing,"
does show up in the game. It's probably when she casts when she face changes, if it does exist. I'm not 100% sure. If it does, it's probably really quiet, but like there's no subtitle for it or anything. But if anything, it would probably be the butterflies take flight section. The thing about this one is that it doesn't really make sense anymore, because Rotten Butterflies specifically mentions the Scarlet Butterflies are the goddess of Rot's wings. Bereft of a master, they were soothed by Romina, who reached out to them. And now, that's really interesting, and it entirely conflicts with Children of the Tower. They could be Children of the Tower now, but they weren't in the first place. They were probably from Malenia's wings. And the main reason I say this is because Blue Dancer Charm and Scorpion Stinger both refer to the God of Rot as a sealed God of Rot, right? Whereas these are referred to as the Goddess of Rot's wings, which is it's just Malenia. It's just Malenia. It's really interesting that like the scorpion motifs are brought back again in Romina, and I think that's really interesting, and there's definitely more I could say about that. And it's also super interesting that Moore and the Forager Brood were also therefore abandoned by Malenia, and they really doubled down on the Forager Brood, therefore like kindred of rot, and then the butterflies are all abandoned, and Malenia actively is shunning her motherhood in this case, right? And motherhood is like a really big theme in both the DLC and in the game in general. But Romina is basically the mother who stepped up in this case for the butterflies. And it's really cool, but again, the same sentiment remains. I think it's just a huge shame that we don't get like a cutscene or anything else. And I think it's especially a shame because she's a fantastic fight. I implore you, anybody who enjoyed that fight even a little bit when they first did it, go get like Shadow Fragment 9 and go fight her as the first Remembrance boss that you do on your next run through. Use her pole blade as well. Like, it's a great weapon. It's a really fun fight, especially when you give it the time to actually sit and fight it. Because if you were like me, you fought her for like the first time, and it was after the majority of the other fights because it's like the point of no return, and she just died. And it was kind of just like, oh, that was a cool fight, but like that was kind of it, you know? Either way, like, it is just kind of a shame that like the voice line itself wasn't in the game. The other thing I think is interesting is that the Goddess of Rot's wings being referenced kind of also just means that Malenia probably has died by this point. I don't think it's necessary. Like, we have evidence that either way that we're on the way to being Elden Lord, and therefore we're probably on the way to fight Malenia. We may not have already done it. It's possible that during her other blooms she had the wings, and that's why she abandons those butterflies. It's possible that the Swamp of Aeonia has butterflies all over it that she's abandoned. But I think, for myself, I think it makes a lot more sense that Malenia is probably dead at this point, which is why Miquella can't bring her, because she is dead. And again, this would get into a whole thing of just like Malenia not showing up in the DLC that much is a shame, but also kind of makes sense because her story is just kind of already over. And FromSoft obviously wanted to tell a story that is entirely apart from the base game, but connected. Like, Shadow of the Erdtree is just as much Elden Ring 2 as it is like an active DLC, which I think is just really interesting. Those are the cut lines. Again, credit to all of the people, links in the description. Thank you guys all for watching. If you disagree with me on any of these things or you think any of them are interesting, please do comment. I do read all of them. Likes and subs are obviously, I like them. I enjoy them. They are really appreciated. But yeah, huge thanks to everyone, and I do intend to get more scripted videos out in the future. I just am super busy in the next few days, and I wanted to just try and get this out as soon as possible. Also, huge thanks to Vince for helping me with some audio editing, and a whole list of other people who I do not have the energy to name right now. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.